She said, when vision fails, direction is lost. When direction is lost, purpose may be forgotten. When purpose is forgotten, emotion rules alone. When emotion rules alone, destruction, destruction.
Is that you've written and you've worked towards something that's called financing people-centered justice, right? And could you let us know about why do you sort of emphasize so much on financing people-centered justice, and what does that really mean when we look at the world right now?
I'm excited to talk about it. And I say that because I would start with one people-centered justice. So definitely that just means like, creating justice systems around people. So before now, I don't know about you, boy, Mike.
But what is needed is we need to, again, bring back the sense and sensibilities into the political discourse.
Data itself has so many biases, bias related to religion, caste, color, even gender.
Hey everyone, I am Pratyaksh, and today, on the occasion of the Global Ethics Day, I have the distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to a special panel discussion organized by the Geostrata in collaboration with the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. This year marks a pivotal moment for democracy and a significant test of civic engagement. In this crucial time, the participation of young people is essential for protecting and strengthening key democratic institutions. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce our brilliant panel members. So we have with us Boyan, a Carnegie Ethics Fellow and the Deputy Director at a Future Agenda UN Foundation. Then we have Dr. Rupinder Oberoi, Professor at the University of Delhi, Mr. Sagar Vishnoi, he's co-founder at the Future Shift Labs, New Delhi. And then we have with us Ms. Kelechi, a lawyer and regional head of Justice Accelerator for the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law. Now, let's start the panel discussion. And I'd like to come first at Boyan. And having sort of gone across your background, one of the things that I observed is that you come from how should I say? Let me put it in the correct way. So you've spent your childhood in a multi-ethnic and confessional community and a region that has gone turbulent transition for conflict. Now, if that's the case, and given one of the themes of a panel discussion is future of democracy, how, in your opinion, do you think that we can make democracy more comfortable with the ideas of multi-ethnicities? What would you have to say on that?
Thanks so much for having me here. It really is a pleasure. To your question, I want to emphasize one of the things that I believe in strongly and that I believe also should not be questioned. And that's the idea that the real test of any democracy, it is how it treats its minority populations. Ultimately, that is where one sees the democracy in actions, when the minority opinions, views, backgrounds are acknowledged, celebrated, and given an opportunity to express themselves in a context. One of the things when one studies the history of democracy, when one looks around at the polarization that's happening today in the world, it is easy to say that polarization is something that's leading to violence, that's leading to disagreements, that's destroying our societies and democracies. But polarization has always been around. What hasn't been around is political leaders who are exploiting polarized society for their benefit, who are using violence to instigate trouble against others who disagree with them. So I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that one of the central elements of democracy is the ability to disagree and to have the norms in place that allow us to disagree and have different opinions, that allow us to be different from each other, and that allow us to live alongside each other despite the differences.
You highlighted one of the points that it's really important for democracies on how they treat their minorities, right? Which is how do they go about it? And that brings me to Mr. Sagar. And the question that I want to put forward is that having gone across your work is centered around AI and politics, right? And there are some of the important questions that Boyan has raised. Now, given that's the case, how do you make sure that political parties ensure that they do not sort of perpetrate the biases that AI or technology would have? What are some of the safeguards available against that?
Sure. Thank you so much, Pratyaksh and Carnegie Council and Geostrata team for having me here. To your question, I believe AI has so many biases right now because the data itself has so many bias related to religion, caste, color, even gender, right? So political parties are ready to use it, but the government have to make AI system biases free. And we are in the very early age of AI revolution where the data itself has uh, numerous number of risks and threats, including environmental risk, privacy risk, biases. Then there is a need to have multi-stakeholder initiatives from the government side, from the big tech side, from political parties to understand the risk associated with AI related to biases, accountability, and privacy, and to create safeguard and safety institutes like many other countries like UK, India, Japan, US are creating AI institutes to have such AI safety norms which can be adopted by deployers, developers, and even by the users.
Okay. So one of the things that I think the panel members, as panel members that all of you represent, is that when I'm asking you one question, they're almost organically leading me to the other panel member, given their expertise. So with that, given you highlighted that there is real danger, and one of the things is that even acknowledging the fact that technologies like AI have real danger in terms of the biases that they might bring onto the table is something that's usually not really done, right? You usually do not find these discussions happening. With that, I want to come to Kilichi. And given that, you sit at the intersection of law and technology, and Mr. Sagar has raised some of the biases that the emerging technologies would, they can bring in. What I want to ask you about is, and I think this is one of the questions that probably concerns all our panel members as well. So when we look at the evolution of technology and the evolution of law, and probably Boyan would agree that technology is rising at a pace which is really hard to catch up with, right? And usually lawmakers and law is seen as a force which is struggling to catch up, struggling to regulate the technology. Now, given that's the case, how do you think, and given your expertise in when it comes to working in the law framework in Africa, how do you think can law actually not only try to catch up with technology, but also sort of try and regulate the technology against some of the dangers that, let's just say, Mr. Sagar has pointed out for all of us?
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the question, and it's really great to be here. I would say that seeing how, yes, I would speak from our perspective, my perspective in Africa, we've had situations where not just for the legal space, I think even regulatory, other sectors where, we're having a lot of the industries innovating. And before you know it, the government brings up one form of regulation or the other, and everything just cripples up. And people that are excited about the potential of what they can do with technology start crying or lamenting because their innovations just goes down the drain. I think that just going straight to the question, one way that this can be prevented is maybe creating testing spaces. And what I mean is maybe something we'll call design thinking, right? So before the government brings out some form of regulation or the other that goes public, why don't we have a pilot test of what that regulation is about in a very controlled environment? So, having that co-designing with different innovators, with technologists, with lawyers, with policymakers, having that pilot test and then figuring out based off whatever iteration of the law or the regulation there is, being able to now take feedback from the different stakeholders and then now take that to the public. I think that's a better route than just coming up with the regulation, not knowing exactly what the end goal is or what the future could look like and throwing that to the public. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So I think you really highlighted this thing that taking feedback from the stakeholders is one of the things that's really important. And that brings me to Dr. Oberoi. And what I want to ask you is that given you're a professor and your work is centered around, let's just say, the young of this nation, what I want to ask you about is what sort of factors do you think that are sort of restricting the participation of the youth into democracy, into institutions of democracy? And do you think there are ways in which we can make it better? What would you say on that?
Hi, thank you, Carnegie, and also the Geostrata for inviting me. You're absolutely right that bringing in the concerns raised by Sagar, Bujan, and Kalichi, yes, we are living in highly polarized worlds. There is fragmentation. There is a concern of what happens in the space of AI. And I think youth are kind of grappling with this changing paradigm, and I personally feel that there's no one meta argument that we can give about what youth are expressing in terms of polarization or their faith in democratic processes. In my understanding, we are seeing this diverse engagement with the policy making, democratic procedures, and also in terms of faith and trust in the democratic institutions, which perhaps is the hallmark of the whole democratic procedures to exist. In my understanding, we are seeing this kind of trend where perhaps in the United States, which is an advanced democracy, you see that there is a kind of a heightened polarization and decline in youth engagement. But in countries like India, the recent elections in 2024 showed that there were almost 67% of youth engagement in various platforms. And so I think it really boils down to, if the issues are being picked up by political parties and political class, which resonates with the youth community, they are ready to engage with the political processes. But on the other side, I also feel that there is kind of multiple barriers like institutional alienation. Often youth feel disconnected with the traditional political concerns and policies which are raised. They also feel that there is too much of corruption, there is too much of unresponsiveness. There is a feeling of powerlessness among the youth also, and kind of low external efficacy among the young people, which leads to kind of a disengagement from the political processes. And of course, there is nepotism, there is dynastic political parties, there is a use of muscle and money power in the politics. So I think youth are trying to process, trying to understand, but I would not say they're completely alienated. They have different concerns. They want political parties to pick up the concerns and issues and agendas which really matter to them. Yeah.
Boyan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I want to agree with Professor Rupinder. I think you really nailed it on the head, right? If you look at the research that's being done across different parts of the world, when you ask young people about their sentiments of democracy, it's not necessarily that they're losing faith in the democracy. They're more so losing faith in the form of democracy they experience, which is not working. And that's the democracy which has barriers for their participation, which actively discourages them from participating. And oftentimes they're looking for alternative ways to engage. And in some countries, yes, that might be the part of party politics, but in many other countries, including in some of the more quote unquote advanced democracies, they're seeking alternative forms of engagement, right? Be it in an online space, be it through informal groupings and gatherings, be it through protests that are taking part in the streets, be it through occupying campuses across Europe and North America. So I think that's very important to underline, that it's not necessarily so much about democracy as a concept, but it's the kind of democracy and institutions that we are experiencing, and the kind of democracy institutions that those who are in power across the world are delivering for young people. And I'll just say this final point. I also firmly believe that democracy itself, in many forms, it can't survive if it doesn't deliver results, right? And that's what young people are seeing. It's not delivering results from them. They want jobs, they want affordable food and housing, they want quality education, they want healthcare, they want peace and security, they want the ability to self-determine the course of their own community and their own nation. And if they're not able to do that through formal means, they're going to be looking for alternative ways to get engaged, get involved, and alternative ways to get themselves organized.
The way both of you, Dr. Oberoi and Boyan, you've spoken, I think everyone's just going to resonate with it, right? Especially as a young person myself, or how should I say, as someone who claims to be young myself, I think I really sort of connected with all of the things that you said. And that brings me from Dr. Oberoi to Boyan again. So we are discussing these larger questions, right? Like the future of democracy and the importance of ethical leadership and youth engagement into all of this. And again, having gone across your work, one thing that I specifically came across is your focusing upon the hyper local context of the problems, right? And there are big questions that we're discussing. So and not only focusing on the hyper local context, but also from the perspective of making cities better. And one of the things that you just talked about is that democracy can survive when it delivers results. So do you think that focusing on these hyper local contexts from the prism of, let's just say, cities or villages, is that one of the solutions in which democracy can deliver better even from the perspective of the youth? What would you say on that?
I hope so. I think so. I believe so. I think some of the results that we're seeing are also proving so. A couple of points that I want to highlight there. One of them is we live in an urbanized world. We live in a world of cities. By the year 2050, 7 out of 10 people across the world are going to be living in the cities. Cities are focal points where people are brushing up against each other, where sure, there are frictions, but also there are great collaboration opportunities and ideas that are coming out of cities across the world. Um, and I do firmly believe that one of some of the closest forms of governments to the people are the local forms of government. It's generally there where the barriers of entry in political process are the lowest. It's at the local level where you see pragmatism being exhibited in terms of compromising and delivering tangible results, which is often hard to see at the national level. It is there also that you have closeness with those who you have elected, right? And I know that in many places around the world, sometimes city officials are appointed, in other places they're directly elected and accounting for all that. But oftentimes, if you live in a small to mid-sized city, you might know who your local elected official is, where they live, and that changes the perception of what governance is and what your role in the governance can be. So yeah, I'm a big believer in hyper-local action in general, but also hyper-local action in cities and urban areas. And let me finish by saying that one of the things that we've seen across Europe and North America when there have been concerns about the future of democracy, good governance, and rule of law on a national level, in many instances, you've seen city leaders step up and say, no, things can be different. We can do things differently. They have been really the bulwarks against the rising authoritarianism. And they're the ones who have experimented with different forms of participation of citizens, be it through participatory budgeting, being through a variety of consultative processes where they try to engage different members of their city, including the young people as well. So I think there's a lot of exciting work happening on an urban city level in places across the world.
One of the things that I'm going to take away from this panel discussion is probably the focus or the notion of focusing on the hyper local context. I think that's something that's really important. And with that, so I saw all of you nodding when Dr. Oberoi was talking about issues like criminalization, right? Or let's just say nepotism, corruption existing into some of the democratic institutions. Now, that brings me to Mr. Sagar. And what sort of, given your extensive work as a political campaigner, one of the questions or ethical questions, right, that I think I should raise up to you or ask you is about criminalization of politics. Now, as people who actively help political parties or political leaders in sort of, let's just say, design their political campaigns, are there any ethical standards that the campaigners themselves sort of adhere to? And in what way do you decide which sort of clientele would you, want to work upon? What would you say on that?
Yes, so I believe it's not about only our country, but it's like the criminalization has been like in in a structured or like a non-structured form is like around the globe. And as far as like my experience is concerned, so like we were very careful while like when we started working with different political parties or even politicians. So we used to like only work with like who's having like very good ethical standard, who comes from the new school of thoughts, and who is open to discuss, even if we are saying that your actions are wrong or your words are wrong. But the thin line isn't there much in the political processes, right? They believe like irrespective of any ethical line or like right or wrong, they want something to get results out of it. They want a winnability factor, whether it is like election or any other democratic process. So yes, like so many campaigners are there who work with different form of politicians who don't adhere to like the ethical line. But I believe over the period of time, and like what I have seen, I have noticed is like the criminalization is decreasing a bit, right? We are getting more educated. Like India is getting more educated politicians in the parliament, in the assembly elections even, and the rate is getting better and better. Even the engagement of youth and women is increasing. Like the women reservation bill has been passed and it's going to be implemented after 3 years. So I believe more such processes are taking place in our country, which is pushing the democratic agenda and engaging more and more people for the betterment.
Okay. So you talked about, or you addressed some of the pertinent questions when it comes to, let's just say, criminalization, right? And how the trend is changing. And I think Kelechi would have a lot to sort of reflect upon that, right? And I'm really fascinated by her work when it comes to at the intersection of justice and law, right? Kilichi, now what I want to come across is that, so I came across the blog that you wrote, which was titled as Passing the Torch, Celebrating the Young Justice Leaders, right? And that's something that really caught my attention. And I was like, what is this young justice leaders? And I would assume even Boyan would be too interested into sort of, knowing about it. So if you could let us know about what is this phenomenon? What is this young justice leaders, and what sort of work are you doing in your region? If you could please let us know.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So the Young Justice Leaders, I am no longer one of it, but it was a fellowship of young people championed by the Pathfinders for Justice organization. And it was a group of like 7 of us across different continents and countries coming together and focusing on access to justice for people from different perspectives. So in my case, my focus was on financing for people-centered justice. I had my colleagues who were focused on justice data. Some were focused on community justice. And it was interesting to see how the concept of justice, we try to make it more practical and relatable instead of the vague concepts. Now we know that a lot of people understand what justice is, or we tend to understand what justice is, but because of how interesting, I'll use that word, the legal system has become and the justice system has become, it is no longer seen as that institution or that concept that you can relate to it. And so for us as young people, we're tasked with the project of making access to justice or the concept of justice more practical to people. And we did that with campaigns, we did that writing blogs, we did that with having opportunities to speak at certain platforms where we had decision makers across government and, calling their attention to certain things that young people were asking for. And like it has been rightly said here, it's not a situation of we young people not being interested in politics or in democracy or even wanting to take charge. I mean, in Nigeria, I would say that in the last election that we had more young people be interested because we want to make a change, because we know that, I mean, in my case, it's like whatever decision is being made right now, my kids are going to be, or hopefully my kids are going to be future generations that will bear the consequence of it. And I don't want that to happen for myself, right? So I am actively interested in making the right decisions for myself and for for the future generation. And so, yeah, that was pretty much what it was. And then passing the torch was just really, taking the first, I think the second step, and then, taking that baton to the rest of the other justice leaders, young people as well, who are, going across breaking down different components of access to justice and making it more practical for people. Thank you.
It wouldn't be wrong for me to say that not only you've been part of, let's just say, the young justice leaders, but that's something hearing from you, I think everyone would agree that you've also sort of embodied, being one of the young justice leaders. And with that, so one of the things that has come across and I've observed in the comments of all of our panel members is the emphasis on youth, right? And how they are a catalyst for making change. With that, I would want to come to Dr. Oberoi, and what I would want to ask you about is, so we've discussed a range of issues as of yet, and one of the underlining themes, and probably who would better understand one of this underlying theme than the young people, is polarization, right? The world is getting hyper polarized on a range of issues, which are just not limited to political questions. Even on something so much so as climate change, the world is getting polarized. Now, given sort of your experience, how do you think we can better navigate this prism when the world is getting more and more polarized?
Yeah, hi. I think we need to keep the context in mind, because this year, like 2024, is also, as you mentioned when you shared the doc with me, that 2024 is a remarkable and a pivotal year in which so many countries have gone in elections, And this also perhaps marks the kind of a litmus test for democratic institutions, and also is a significant indicator to the civic engagement and democratic processes. And usually what we are witnessing is the year or a year ahead of elections gets hyper polarized, and there is a kind of a divisiveness, extreme and provocative narratives, and also what is known in social science as othering of the various communities. Particularly, for example, in US, the migration issue has really picked up or resonating with communities, or also the abortion issue. So what we are witnessing is also this kind of a silos and echo chambers tend to emerge, where the possibility of enlightened and civic discourse and deliberations on policies and manifestos really goes to the back burner. And most of the political leaders try to address to the emotions or emotive issues, which create these extreme sentiments among the electorate. We are also seeing, geopolitical volatility in terms of what is happening between Ukraine and Russia, and also Middle East, and all these, bakes into these narratives where it's important for ethical discourse based on what a utilitarian thinker would talk about, like a Benthamite ethics would come forward and say, let's talk about the common good, the essential role and responsibility of political institutions, and more so the democratic institution, is to provide the maximum good for maximum number. Means that's the bottom line of all political institutions to exist. But also, we need to somewhat think deeper are we sort of not trying to understand politics and political institutions from a very ethical standpoint? And means I'm a great fan of political philosophers like Aristotle and Kantian ethics, for example, the categorical imperative and virtue ethics, and what Plato talked about. All those we can debate about whether they are the best torch bearers for ethical leadership. But what is needed is we need to, again, bring back the sense and sensibilities into the political discourse. Sagar is there from the social media and AI and as young people and students, we are consuming from social media. And by default and by design, social media creates this accentuated polarization, and which further reinforces the biases and entrenches the divisiveness and the fault lines in the society. So we really need to have this kind of role model and ethical leaders who can cultivate virtues of empathy, accountability, transparency in the decision making, and align themselves with the what I would call is normative ethical theories, which may seem very archaic, but that's an underpinning and a fundamental pillar of political discourse to happen. So going back to some of the virtues and ethics and utilitarian principles, why does political institutions exist? Those kind of fundamental interrogation is needed by the electorate and youth and all the stakeholders to bring back the compass onto ethics and what are the deliverables by the political class to the common people. And that is getting missed. That is where I see a problem which is working to the advantage of the political leaders and people who are short-sighted and want to encash upon political emotions and sentiments rather than a very sensible, thorough policy making.
So many interesting things to sort of pick up, and then I'm prompted to ask you many questions onto that thing. And I saw almost all panel members sort of acknowledging and resonating with the things that you said. And so you brought this point out that while the political parties or the political class is concerned about the greatest happiness of the greatest number, but then why that maxim is just not enough, and how ethics need to be sort of bridge in to sort of help for going beyond, let's just say, for the notion of greatest happiness for the greatest number, that being one of the possible reasons for the polarity. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to come to Boyan again, and let's tap into sort of your understanding of ethical leadership. So, what I would want to ask you about is, how does the Carnegie Council work towards infusing ethical standards into the world of international affairs, given that we're observing that the world is going through a range of crises, not limited to wars, which evoke or invoke the necessity of being, more ethical? What would you say on that?
Yeah, I very much resonated with what Dr. Oberoi was saying. And this is where Carnegie Council comes in when it comes through for its program on Carnegie Ethics Fellows, which is currently recruiting, and the application is still open for a day or two, so do check it out. But it finds young people who are keen to be leaders in their fields, in business, politics, social realms, academia, whatever other field, and works with them really to acknowledge and further reflect on how they are cultivating these values of empathy, of accountability, of transparency in whatever they're trying to do. I do want to emphasize another point, which Kelechi brought out and Dr. Ober also highlighted, which I think is essential when we think about ethical leaders for the future, and that is long-term thinking. Having a vision that extends beyond the election cycle of 2, 3, 5 or more years, having the ability to think about the challenges that we're confronting today, the challenges of this century as well, and extending the timeline and thinking about the actions that we make today and how they're impacting, sure, present day people, but also the future generations as well. Because we've seen that today we live with the failings of the decisions of those who came before us, and that's why we have as immense challenges as we do. And yeah, I think that comes down to having a long-term vision. And in preparing for this conversation, one of the things that I went back to is Octavia Butler, who's an American novelist. She was wise on so many things, but I want to read a quote from her. It's very brief, which talks about the importance of vision. She said, "When vision fails, direction is lost. When direction is lost, purpose may be forgotten. When purpose is forgotten, emotion rules alone. When emotion rules alone, destruction, destruction." And I think that's important for us to have in mind as we think about our democracies today, as we think about polarization in our democracies, as we think about also who we are uplifting in positions of power and who are the people who have the authority to make decisions about our future and the future of our children. Are those the people who rule by emotion, or are those people who offer us a different kind of vision, a better vision of the world that we can live in?
As someone who loves poetry and who occasionally reads poetry, right, I cannot sort of tell you how much I loved you invoking Olivia, right, into the discussion. That's one of the things. With that, I originally planned that I'll be coming to Mr. Sagar, but given the poetry you raised and some of the things that you talked about, first I'll come to Kilichi and then I'd like to come to Mr. Sagar, right? So, Kilichi, again, I'm almost fascinated by the work profile that you have. And one of the things, again, is that you've written and you've worked towards something that's called financing people-centered justice, right? And could you let us know about why do you sort of emphasize so much on financing people-centered justice, and what does that really mean when we look at the world right now?
I'm excited to talk about it. And I say that because I would start with one, people-centered justice. So definitely that just means like, creating justice systems around people. So before now, I don't know about you, but in my case, or where I come from, justice institutions are created more to be justice institutions and not necessarily around people. Or about people. And the whole idea of people-centered justice is making that shift in mindset. So what exactly do people want? What kind of justice systems do they need? Instead of creating courts that people do not particularly have the means or cannot afford to go to or cannot even access lawyers, why not leverage the community justice system that they already have in place and make it work for them? And so financing people-centered justice just means, again, changing mindsets of people in government, or people that makes these decisions and say, maybe don't build courts anymore. Maybe don't have more judges. Maybe don't have more lawyers. Maybe just focus on the people. Maybe ask the people, what exactly do they want? How exactly do they want what will be their preferred justice solution to a particular problem, and then fund that because it works for them, rather than imposing the formal justice system on them, right? Leverage the community justice system, leverage an informal justice system. Invest in mobile courts, right? So if someone has to work a really long long miles actually, or kilometers to get to court, and that's not sustainable. I mean, I wouldn't want to go there. Why not find a way to bring the courts to them? So pretty much that's what financing people-centered justice means, right? Figuring out what works, what has worked for people, what is working, and being able to scale that and fund that. So again, don't build any more courts. Stop building courts, right? If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Figure out what works for the people and try to scale that.
This is such an interesting sort of notion that you sort of bring about, is that when we talk about justice, right, we implicitly seem to think of courts, going to the lawyers. And well, that's a wonderful, that's the best option that people have, but it's also really important to sort of acknowledge and understand that not everyone has the access to courts and legal systems, and then you sort of bring about this notion that maybe there's a solution wherein you might not necessarily have to go to the courts, which are becoming more expensive by the day, and that there is another notion which is people-centered, or financing people-centered justice is just again one of the things that it just opens up your mind into thinking about so many aspects. With that in mind, one of the last questions for Mr. Sagar, and then we'd go forward to the Q&A session, and let's just say if any questions as panel members you would have for each other. So, Mr. Sagar, we've discussed again range of issues about democracy, about the young people. So my final question for this round to you is going to be, and the floor is open to other panel members as well if you want to sort of pitch in. Given the discussion that we've had so far and your respective personal experiences, where do you think the youth of the current world is standing right now when it comes to the political space or the political institutions? Are we at a significant juncture as a young demography? And what sort of, where are we headed from here on, Mr. Sagar?
Yes, I believe for young people, there are a lot of challenges which didn't exist at a scale in eras earlier than us, like the polarization, which Rupinder pointed out and even Boyan pointed out. So the polarization which is taking place, and the young people are surrounded by uh, digital identities, like they are spending a lot of time digitally. So yes, uh, we are living in a post-truth era, or like deepfake era, and we get to know about the truth later. So it's very difficult for them to understand and fight it out against this polarization. But yes, the opportunities are huge. Like if we talk about our demography, and like we have a so good population, young population, and we have that much capacity to accommodate into the political systems, the kind of opportunities even our country has regarding political institutions. uh, Numerous programs are getting launched, political incubators are there, political companies are getting launched now. The boom of political consulting, which came long back, like 40 years back in US and the Western countries, has now arrived in India. So, and we are seeing a lot of campaigners and consultants uh, almost advising almost every politician nowadays. But it becomes important for them to draw an ethical line and understand like what needs to be done to make the democratic values strong, right? And I hope like this is the point which they need to understand. Like there are so many uh, hurdles and challenges in front of them, but following ethical line, when the democratic values, losing a democratic values is so easy in our time, is becomes very much important.
All right. With that is okay. So I just, as someone who claims to be a good moderator, I'd like to ask all our panel members, is there anyone who sort of wants to pitch in when it comes to the place of the young demography in the political side before we sort of go on to the other round?
Can I pitch in a small point here?
Sure. And then we go to Boyan as well. I saw him wanting to speak.
Yeah.
Sure.
So adding on to what Sagar has just alluded to, means just to give a small perspective of what I think about it. Means I believe that the next generation is also growing up in a very sort of hyper connected world, where local actions and local issues have the possibility of transcending to global level and vice versa. Black Lives Matters, for example, was an issue during the COVID time, which resonated across the world. So what I think is this generation tends to embrace global citizenship, where the ethical considerations transcend the national boundaries and include concerns for global community, future generations, and climate or environmental concerns, for example. So there's a kind of a rise of cosmopolitan ethics, which argues that ethical responsibilities tend to or has to extend beyond local and national boundaries in today's context. The climate justice movement, which underpins itself on the issue of intergenerational justice, or what Peter Singer talks about, the concept of expanding moral circles, where he argues that human moral concern has historically expanded and will continue to expand from small local groups and problems to include humanity, then to even include non-human animals and future generations. So I think we need to drill down and have our conversations around this thing. Another point, the emergence of ethical consumerism and conscious capitalism, where I think the youth are using their power to send a message to capitalists and big corporates that you need to adopt ethical practices. The circular economy, the concern for the environment, how do you dump your goods? And we just lost our legendary businessman from India, Ratan Tata, and he sort of related with this concern because he was a huge philanthropist connected to the next generation, giving this immense significance to plowing back the profit and addressing to the concern which we refer to as a triple bottom line, where profit, planet, and people have to be thought about as a quintessential fundamental role of the corporates if they have to sustain and exist and create harmonious societies. So just to add on to what Sagar and others have been alluding to in the conversation. Thank you. Yeah.
You're most welcome. Boyan?
Ooh, many things that I would like to say. I just want to highlight the point about cosmopolitan ethics and the idea that local action, but local action that's hyper local, but that's connected to uber global as well. I think there's something to be said about that, about both of those extremes there. And I do want to highlight a quick point on demography. The demography is changing the world today, particularly some parts of the world at a much more rapid pace than others, right? If I'm not mistaken, in India, 50% of the population is young, under the age of 30. In many countries across sub-Saharan Africa, those percentages are 60, 70% or more. And for me, that's where the excitement is, that's where the energy is, and that's where an opportunity to create some of these better ethical futures are as well. And I'm sure Kelechi might have a few thoughts on that as well, but that's what I get excited about when I think about the future of the planet as a whole.
Kelechi?
No, I would prefer not to say anything right now.
All right. With that, with a wholesome exchange of these views, okay, let's come to the Q&A round. So people that have been watching us live on YouTube have put in a lot of questions for all our panel members. And I think we're good to go with the Q&A session, right? Shall we begin? All right, wonderful. So one of the first questions is, again, for Kelechi, is that, so one of the viewers have pointed out that, you work as a regional head of justice, and then law is something which is uniform, right? It brings in uniformity. But given, again, your work experience or work profile, you worked with communities of people that must be, very diverse, right? Diverse groups. So how do you make sure that the uniformity that law brings in, it does not sort of impede upon the diversity of the people, and especially the communities with which you sort of work? What would you say on that?
So I would say that the law was made, or people made the law for themselves. I'm really not sure exactly how to put it, but like my point is, the law isn't supposed to be rigid in that sense. So it's like on a buying it basis. Of course, it helps to regulate exactly how we live. Well, it shouldn't be the all in all in that sense. So how do we do it? We contextualize it. I think that's the word that I would use. So it's like, in as much as we have the laws and regulations for the country, when we go to communities, we take out different laws, because in our case, we have the country and then we have states, or I don't know, I call it regions or provinces, and those states also have their localized laws as well. So we make that like contextualized. So as much as we have diverse people, we try to ensure that we're able to localize the laws for their own knowledge knowledge, and so they don't necessarily have to bother with, figuring out exactly which part of the laws apply to themselves, because we've been able to take exactly what applies to them and share that with them. And I think that's pretty much how one of the ways in which we get to manage the diversity with people and also the laws. But again, still working with the mindset that we make the laws for ourselves, and I'm really not sure how best to put that. I'm sure it's going to come back to me, but the point is, it shouldn't be very rigid, and I think that's a lesson, or that should be a lesson to the government, and even seeing how law in itself is a rigid profession. So we talk about the adoption of technology, innovation, and all of that, and we realize that lawyers are very not happy to adopt or adapt to technology in itself. We pride ourselves in holding on to traditions and holding on to things that have been passed down. And I think now, especially in my generation and young people as well, we're learning that that shouldn't be the case. So we are opening up, we're being flexible. And yeah, I think that's really helping with seeing how to work with diverse people and work with what the law gives to us.
You talked about contextualizing the sort of, the laws basically, and how lawyers sort of, I think a lot of lawyers are going to like the point how it's even almost a pride thing, right? That, they are the holders of tradition when it comes to that. With that, I come to the second question. So I think a lot of our viewers have really appreciated Dr. Oberoi's her invoking a lot of ethical maxims into our discussion. And that brings me to the question that is there for Dr. Oberoi is, so one of our viewers have pointed out that, are you satisfied with the current educational framework that exists for the young people to sort of instill ethical values in them? Because the world is facing a lot of complex challenges which demand a nuanced perspective on ethics. So do you think we need a better as young people, or let's just say as people in general, do you think we need a better understanding of ethics given the current challenges that we are facing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'll give you this answer to what I actually do when I teach in University of Delhi. So there are two forums that I've created. One is the NITI, which is Young Leader Policy Discourse Forum. And another one is the Center for Innovation and Social Enterprise. Now, both of these are unique initiatives in Delhi University, particularly the Center for Innovation and Social Enterprise. And what we do in this center, because a lot of innovation is often associated with tech, right? Creating of apps, but the social innovation here again is a very niche area, which is trying to bring in empathy in understanding how social change can be triggered. So what we do in this research center is we actually take field visits to the rural marginalized sections of India. And India, even though we are projected to be one of the largest economy very soon, one of the rapidly growing economy, the reality is that large segment of Indian society still are deprived of education, health facilities, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So what we do in this center is we are increasingly incorporating ethics into the curricula. We are, what we say is, experiential learning and empathy, understanding. And not only that the social sciences need things, I also believe that courses like environmental ethics, bioethics, business ethics have to bring in the culture of ethical thinking and ethical underpinning for the future. I think it's existential. I mean, there's no longer a debate that we should or should not, or ought to or ought not to, in a sense that when you're looking at the climate change, we're looking at the climate hazards, the impact on the lives of the people, I think we are at the threshold where we act now and not contemplate and get into those, hyper nuanced debates about what is going to happen at 1.5 and 2.0, temperature rises, or et cetera, et cetera. So I personally believe that experiential learning, empathetic understanding, inclusive dialogue are some of the methodologies and pedagogical tools which will connect the students, or particularly this generation, to real world context, and thereby enhance the ethical reasoning of what kind of world they want to see in next 40, 50 years. What do they visualize? What is the future of the society? And what is harmonious living? What is blissful living? And that is where the compass and the trajectory and the course curriculum should also spotlight, besides all the technical and super specialized disciplines which are being taught at university. So, and mentorship, role models, bringing in from academia, industry, to get exposure is so important. So going outside the classroom, what Gandhi would have said, using your head and also your hands is so powerful, so powerful. And I understand this is a generation of computers and online learning, but using your hand is a powerful, powerful tool of learning and creating solutions for the problems which are so wicked, so stubborn, and which requires different approach, a bottom-up approach, perhaps, to challenge and move the paradigm to happier times to exist. That's my take on that.
I think once the panel discussion gets done, I'm going to come back to it again and again and sort of like, take notes and sort of, have a nuanced perspective over some of the things that you've highlighted. With that, okay, we have interesting questions for Boyan. And I think one of the viewer has really appreciated you bringing in the poetry, and they've come with themselves with another quote. So I'd quote one of the UN Secretary Generals, and what he said was, "What we put into our destiny is ours, but what we're not allowed to choose is the frame of it." With that, I'd ask the question that's there. So what they're trying to ask you is that, given that that it said that we're not allowed to choose the frame of it, do you think as young people, are we lacking in some sort of morality or the values that we sort of hold up for ourselves? And how, if there is a way we can reframe or restructure the ethical framework that we've built around us, what would you say?
Oh, it's a big question, but let me say that that's actually one of my favorite quotes as well. It's from Doug Hammarskjöld, who was the second Secretary General of the United Nations. A modest civil servant who was elevated to his position of a Secretary General a little bit by surprise, and who ended up dying a tragic death when his plane went down under mysterious circumstances over what is today Congo's Zambia border. Sorry, that got me a little bit distracted on a history lesson about Doug Hammarskjöld, because that was a moral and an ethical leader who set a compass in an otherwise troubled world, who was able to bring together parties that were disagreeing in dialogue, who was effective in his work and innovative in his work also when it comes to piloting initiative on an international level, including the idea of peacekeeping, which came from him and his collaborator at the time, Lester Pearson, who was a Canadian. I, to your question, I want to go back to my previous response. I do think that the young generations, to which I only up until recently was belonging to, they're underestimated. I do think that many of them do have a good moral compass. I do think that they have access to swaths of information, that they're able to connect in a variety of ways, that they're able to explore variety of opinions and perspectives. They're more connected than ever. They're traveling around the world as well, and that's accessible no longer just to the privileged classes as well. And I think this ability to connect, the ability to travel, the ability to engage in some of the experimental learning that Dr. Oberoi was talking about really gives me hope that no, our future will be bright. It will be bright in India. It will be bright across the world as well.
Okay. I have one last question for you, or let's just say, not a question per se, before we sort of come to the end of this panel discussion, is that see, as a Carnegie Ethics Fellow and a young person in general as well, could you help us sort of know about the importance of the Global Ethics Day? And that's also a reason why we're doing this panel discussion, and we have all of you amazing people over here. So if you could let us know something about the Global Ethics Day and why is it important?
Global Ethics Day is this. It's an opportunity once a year, even though I believe it should be done more than once a year, to really think about how ethics informs our decisions that we're making in life, in our professional lives, in our personal lives, in our lives as active citizens of our communities, countries, and the world. It takes place generally on the third Wednesday of every October. And all across the world, in universities, in community centers, town squares, and where not, you do have people who come together to engage in questions and explore different ethical dimensions of different issues that they're interested in and that are relevant to them. So it's great to be part of it.
Hopefully, no, I wouldn't say hopefully, but given that we've done this panel discussion on this Global Ethics Day, I think even as Geostrata, as a young organization in collaboration again with the Carnegie Council, we'd like to do a whole lot of events, a whole lot of things centered around the Global Ethics Day. And we'd hear from all of you again. Like, this is not the first and the last time that we're having the amazing. I'm just amazed by the pointers that all of you have raised. And probably we do much more about the Global Ethics Day. Again, as Boyan has pointed out, why just keep it limited to just one day in a year? Probably we can have numerous events and discussions and whatnot, podcasts around the thing. With that in mind, I think we are nearing, or we are almost at the end of this brilliant panel discussion. Amazing discussion. I'm grateful to all of you, our brilliant panel members. And as GeoSata, we're also grateful to the Carnegie Council and the team for sort of, helping bring across all of the people and putting across this brilliant panel discussion on Global Ethics Day. With that, thank you so much to all our panel members. Thank you to the Carnegie Council. And we hope to hear from you again and see you all soon.